Welcome back, Scratchers. We've added a lot of things to our game, but we have an interesting aspect in that we basically have infinite lives in this game. What if we wanted to limit the number of player lives? Something else interesting is if we're firing our guns and we actually hit, we can still fire our gun while we're invisible, and that probably is not something we want to have happen. So we need to add some idea of state and then also potentially the idea of player lives to our game. Let's tackle the first of those as the state. So if we come back to variables, we have our list, but we can also make a variable just holds a single value. And we're going to add a variable for player state. I'm going to go ahead and let all sprites see this. We could also limit it to this sprite. Right now, we don't need the other sprites to know about it, but at some point we might want to let the whole game know if the player is alive or not. And I'm going to go ahead and say when we first start the game, we're going to set that to alive. We could also just use a number, like 1 to represent alive, 0 to represent dead. That would also be fine. But I like to actually spell it out a little bit. I think it's easier for people reading our code to understand what the intent was. And then the same thing when we die, and change that state to dead. What is the point of having this state? Well, if we go look at our space key pressed here, which is what actually fires our bullet, we can just check to see what that current state is and put this inside of a if block so that we can only fire if the player in his state is alive. Now notice that this is a triangle block. We can't stick this directly in there, so we're going to have to use some kind of operator block. We've already used the less than or greater than. There's also this equal, which tests to see if the left-hand side and the right-hand side are the same values. And that works for strings, like alive, as well as for numbers. Now we can say, if we're alive, we're allowed to shoot. If we're not alive, we're not allowed to shoot. Let's see that. I have to let myself die. I was spamming the space bar, but we did not get bullets. But notice, I don't get bullets now either. So as soon as we come back to life, we have to change that state again. So if we go back to our variables and set that player state to alive right before we show up. We can't fire. Here again, we can fire. So we've now added a little bit of a state machine there. And I don't necessarily need to show that that player is alive, so I'll uncheck that box. Now the other thing I said we would do is we'd actually add the idea of player lives. We also have a variable for that. And we can leave that for all sprites or for this sprite only. If we start having life power-ups to pick up on the stage, depending on who's handling that, if they handle adding the lives to the player, then it would be for all sprites. In this case, I think we could also just do that directly from the player itself. But we'll add those lives, and when we start the game, let's go ahead and set player lives to 3. Then every time we die, we can change player lives by -1. And then we can check before we allow the player to come back to life that that player is actually alive or has lives left. So we could check to see if the lives value is greater than 0. So we need to get that variable. Now, die 3 times, should stop coming back to life. And that gives us player lives.